Oh, it's time to get some interaction going. That's the problem with these learning spaces, or these spaces in general. The audience is put in a passive role, so I hope to actually engage you all, get you doing something. In fact, in my workshop, I'm going to show some data, some absolutely mind-blowing data that were collected at MIT that showed that people in an auditorium, including students in the classroom, have less brain activity when they're sitting in an auditorium than when they're sleeping in their bed. So this is what I'd like to do in the next half hour. I'd like to talk a little bit about education. What is it that we mean with that word? And next I'd like to talk about peer instruction, which is a pedagogy. Thank you, Kirsty, for bringing out the importance of pedagogy as opposed to technology, that I developed after discovering that in spite of getting really high ratings for my teaching, both by students and by colleagues, my students were learning next to nothing. Well, that was a pretty disheartening discovery, and I completely revised my approach to teaching, which I'll be presenting in the second part of my talk. And lastly, since we're in an academic setting here, there'll be a test, right? So you better pay attention. Otherwise, you'll be in trouble at the end of my presentation. So let's start by talking about education. And given the fact that all over the globe we use the same types of learning spaces, the same type of lectures to teach, a logical question to ask is, what is it that happens in a lecture? Right? So let's take this picture again of me teaching there. Incidentally, why did I teach that way? I taught that way because I never even asked myself, how do people learn? How should one teach? I simply did to my students what my professors had done to me, projecting my own experiences onto the world around me. I think that the one gentleman there who said transmitting information, however, said exactly the right thing. Most of our lectures, most of our classes focus on the transmitting of information. Is that what education is? Is education just the transmittal of information? So, what would be the logical thing to do if education was just the transfer of information? What should we all do? Get robots, yeah, or actors maybe. And in a sense, some of that is already happening. Not the robots, but what I have in mind. Videotape the best possible teachers, the best possible lectures, and put it online. One in English, one in British English, one in UK English, in US English, one in Spanish, one in Chinese. Every maybe 10 years you need to update it because clothing changes. But what would you lose? What would you lose by doing that? Interaction. But how much interaction do we really have? Look how hard I have to work to get you to interact. Right? How much interaction do we have? Right? I mean, I often observe teachers, and they teach, and then they stop and say, does anybody have a question? Anybody? And you know how it is, right? The students look down because they don't want to make eye contact. And if you wait long enough that it becomes uncomfortable, it's always the same student in the front row who reluctantly raises his or her hand. So I don't think we'd lose much interaction. But we'd gain a lot. Students could watch the lectures whenever they want. They don't have to be in 1 hour block. They could be in 7-minute blocks or, by concepts or subjects. But there's something else. You could actually think. Have you ever had a student in your class raising his hand and say, Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think. This never happened in my classroom. But when you're listening to somebody, I don't know if you paid attention in other talks, do that. It's very hard to think. There's no opportunity to think because your brain is held hostage by the presenter. If you stop to think and dream, you lose track of what is being said. We're very poor multitaskers. So that's one advantage. The other one is you could rewind and listen again. And you could do it independently of the other students in the class. Or you could call up a friend and say, hey, do you understand what Professor Mazur says at 8 minutes and 21 seconds? So there are a lot of advantages. But, of course, and I'm happy we agree on that, 99% of you is convinced that there's more to education than just the transmittal of information. What do you need in addition to the transfer of information? Challenge. Relationships. Personality. Feedback. Hey, we just did an exercise at the beginning of my keynote here. What was the result of that? Practice, of course. You know, and the learner has to do something with that information. It's not just that we open our skull, put the information in, and that's it. You need to connect it to your experiences. You need to build models. You need to apply, to be able to apply the knowledge embedded in that information into a new situation. I think the true hallmark of education is being able to take what you've learned and apply it in a new context. That is what real learning is. But so much of education is simply the professor delivering information to the students, then you wait 1 or 2 months, and the students basically regurgitate the same information back on the assessment to the instructor. I wish we had more time to talk about assessment. I'll bring it in my workshop, because I think assessment is the silent killer of educational innovation. And unless we rethink our approach to assessment, it's going to be very difficult to make any meaningful change to our approach to education. Most students don't study to learn. No, they study for the test. They study to pass the exam. So it's the exam, the assessment, that drives the study habits. And as long as our assessment basically simply asks for information that is regurgitated back, you know, we're never going to produce students who can actually do meaningful skills. So what is important is not the transfer of information, but the assimilation thereof, or in the words of Piaget, the accommodation, right? Adjusting the information to the mental models that are already present in your brain. Now, where did that happen for you? And for me, I've often asked myself, where did the aha moments occur? The, oh, no, I get it. Think about it for a moment. Did that happen while you were sitting in a room like this, listening to an instructor? Yes or no? No, I see most people shake no. No, it probably happened outside of the classroom. So if we think of education as a two-step process, one, transfer of information, because, look, we need transfer of information, right? No transfer of information, no education at all. But then the second step, assimilation of that information, and we ask ourselves, which of those two steps is the hardest step, the most elusive step? I think we would all agree it's step number 2, not step number 1. In the traditional approach to teaching, all of the emphasis is on the transfer of information, which takes place in the class. And the assimilation, the making sense, is left to the student on his or her own outside of class. And that's what we should really focus on. So 22 years ago, when I discovered how ineffective my standard approach to teaching was, I decided to invert this and to put all of the emphasis on the second part, leaving the first part to the students outside of the class. And in class, developing activities that help my students make sense of the information. Now, there's a lot of talk and discussion of the out-of-class component. How do we take the information and transfer it to the students out of the class? As if this is a new problem. Of course, the biggest invention in information technology solved that. And I'm not talking about the computer, I'm talking about the book. Gutenberg, 500 years ago, already developed something, a technique, to disseminate information outside of the classroom. And now with the internet and video and YouTube and so on, there are many more approaches. Most of them, however, are simply old wine into new bottles. People take a lecture, film it, put it online. To me, that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happens inside the class. So I now ask my students to read before coming to class, or to watch a video of a lecture that I've given before, or to do some other kind of activity. And I prime them by asking some questions. And then in class, I teach not by telling, but I teach by questioning. Nothing new there, right? Because Socrates, 2,000 years ago, already said, we should teach by questioning, not by telling. So I walk into the classroom, I talk a few minutes, and then I ask a question. And I give the students time to think. I'm silent, the other students are silent, they can think. After they thought for a while, I poll their answers. Initially it was multiple choice question, now with learning analytics I can use any type of questions, including graphical questions. Or, you know, I could show them a painting and ask them to identify people. If you're interested in how that technology works, that will be later this afternoon. After I've polled them, I tell them, now turn to your neighbor, a neighbor who has a different answer, and try to convince that neighbor of your answer. The first time I did it because I tried to explain a problem in 2 different ways for 10 minutes. And the students were so confused that they were unable to articulate a coherent question. You know how it is, right? If you're really confused about something, it's hard to pinpoint what is the cause of that confusion. And in a moment of despair, I told my students, why don't you discuss it with each other? And something happened that I had never seen in my classroom. You know, and I have about 200 students in my classroom. The whole classroom erupted in chaos. They forgot about me in front of the classroom. I could have walked away, they wouldn't have noticed it. What's more, in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I had for 10 minutes unsuccessfully tried to explain it, and in 2 minutes they figured it out. I had trouble understanding that at first. But imagine you have 2 students sitting next to each other, Mary and John. Mary has the right answer because she understands it. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. But, and this is the most important point, Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned it. She still knows what the difficulties are that John has. Whereas Professor Mazur learned it such a long time ago, to him it is so clear that he no longer understands the difficulties that a beginning learner has.